I'm Pamela Young and this is Thrive 2030, brought to you by Growth Curve. And today I have with me Eduardo Pedrosa, who is in Singapore. Eduardo is the Secretary General of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council. Hello, Eduardo. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks very much for having me here, Pamela.
Oh, you're most welcome. It's really good to see you, and I really appreciate your giving us some time out of your busy day. Now, you're in Singapore, and it's obviously a very beautiful day as normal, I would expect.
Yep, it's a blue sky today.
And what's the temperature there at the moment?
Well, it's freezing in my office, but it looks like it's about 32 out there.
You have your aircon too high.
Well, look, it's set at about, I think we've got these regulations. We're set at 27, but for whatever reason, it's absolutely freezing in here.
Feels like 17. Well, let's see if we can warm you up, because look, I've got this beautiful vista of Singapore, so I've come to join you. I used to live in Singapore for a while, and I just love the developments that have occurred since I left, and this is one of them. So it's nice to be with you. Can I just take a moment to introduce you to our folks who are listening today? Eduardo is, as you can probably tell from his accent, he's British, and he was raised in England and studied at the London School of Economics, after which he decided he might like to explore his cultural heritage in the Philippines and went to work for the Philippine government for a few years, and also worked for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which is perhaps you could describe the basis of that organization, Eduardo.
So this is one of the German Stiftungen. So it's a foundation that sort of promotes regional cooperation and on a range of issues. And one of them is ASEAN and regional cooperation out of its different offices. And it was great fun, and it continued some of the work that I was doing for the Philippine government on regional cooperation. It was a great ride, and it continued some of my interests in regional cooperation while I was there.
Fantastic. It sounds like a really interesting job. And then you decided to move to Singapore, where you have worked with both the Economist Intelligence Unit and where you are now at the Pacific Economic Cooperative Council. So you have a very big career in government and political organizations in the region, working on issues of the Asia and Pacific regions. So I'm really excited to have an opportunity to hear your perspectives post-COVID, although we're not quite out of it, but we are in our second year, aren't we? So I would like to explore with you some of the issues that you were dealing with before COVID arrived and how things have changed for your members. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind just sharing with us a few minutes on what does the PECC do and what is its primary objective for its members?
Thanks. Well, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council was founded in 1980, and its objective was really to serve as a platform to promote regional cooperation around the Pacific Rim. I mean, if you think back to 1980, there really wasn't very much opportunity for governments, businesses, and academics to come together. But at that time, there was increasing interaction between governments and businesses coming together. So it was an initiative of then Prime Ministers Malcolm Fraser and the then Japanese Prime Ministers to try and see what we could do. You couldn't get governments to formally get together, but we decided to do it at what we call a Track 2 platform, an unofficial platform, to see what we could do. And the sort of the idea was, even though you had greater interdependence, meaning greater business interactions and so on and so forth, those sort of business interactions didn't mean that you necessarily had a basis for really coming together. So what PECC was trying to do was trying to see what that basis would be and how we come together. So that's really what we do. So our objective is to try and create the basis for a Pacific-wide community, and that's what we do. We try and bring the sort of the Pacific community together by working on common challenges, bringing different stakeholders together. So our membership is business, government, academia, and so on. So we call ourselves a multi-stakeholder community today.
Yes. Now, I do recall you also are a advisory member to the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. So in your tenure, you've been with the PECC for over about 20 years. And in that time, have the expectations of your members changed in terms of what they have been asking from you? And I'm just wondering, the risk profile must have changed over those years?
I mean, it's changed tremendously. I mean, if you think over the whole course of those 20 years, the issues have changed. I mean, if you go back to the early 2000s, things were extremely different. At the beginning of the 2000s, you were just beginning to be a more digital world. You went through the IT bubble, if you like. Then we went through the global financial crisis, and then we've going through now this global pandemic. One of the things that's really been of great concern to us is this rising trend towards protectionism, and that's of great concern to all of us in this region, because trade has really been the basis of economic growth in the Asia Pacific region for the past 30 to 40 years. If you think of how the economies and businesses of the region have been growing so tremendously, that's been on the basis of trade. So if you have growing protectionism, how will the economies of this region continue to grow? So people have been looking at that and asking, what will the future shape of growth be?
So with the shift since COVID, what have been the things that have been of major concern to your members from a risk point of view?
I mean, obviously dealing with the pandemic is absolutely number one. I mean, that's, how do we deal with this? How do all of us get out of this situation? We're still very much in pandemic mode. Some parts of the world are getting towards high levels of vaccination, and hopefully they'll be able to exit that. So where I live in Singapore, we're at about 55% and over vaccination. So hopefully we'll be able to open up. Other parts of the region are at much lower rates. So you're looking at a two-speed recovery that comes with different sets of risks. So the overwhelming priority is, how do we get more people vaccinated around the world? And that's not just in the Asia Pacific region, it's all across the world. And it's not just because we need to care about each other, but it's because that in itself comes with other risks. You've seen now the emergence of other variants of the COVID-19 crisis. If those variants come in to our economies, you risk third, fourth, fifth waves of the pandemic. And we've seen that in Singapore. I think you're seeing that in Australia and other places. So it's in our own best interest to make sure that we stamp out, as much as possible, the virus, and we get everyone vaccinated around the world as quickly as possible. So really the challenge is, how do we scale up the manufacturing of vaccines and get them distributed across the world as quickly as possible, so that we minimize the emergence of the variant of the virus.
So is that a topic of conversation at your member meetings? How do we scale up, and how do you support one another?
Yes. Yeah. So that's a major issue. So how do you deal with say the intellectual property regime? What's our stand on this? What's the best way to, say, have voluntary partnerships between those who hold the intellectual property, partnerships between them and the manufacturing? Or what are the logistics challenges that we face? I think we all know that none of us are traveling. Right?
Yes.
I mean, that's, of course, it's a pain. It hurts a lot of businesses, but about 50% of global trade, of aviation trade, rides in the belly of passenger aircraft. So that means that a lot of trade isn't happening. So the cost of trade has almost doubled in terms of aviation. That's a real logistics problem that we're facing right now. So those are the kinds of issues that we need to address. How do you scale that up? What do we do in this current situation? How do you get the whole logistics ecosystem moving so that we can help in this process? So there'll be sets of recommendations coming out on that.
Okay, so many things I want to ask you. Perhaps for people listening, it would be helpful for you to just briefly outline who your member countries are, because we've got East Asia and West America and everything in between. So could you just run through, because in terms of a global trade basis, you've got some of the biggest economies in this group. Biggest economy.
So the easiest way to understand our membership is Pacific Basin. So it's those economies that are littoral around the Pacific Basin. So this stretches, say, from New Zealand, Australia, all the way through up East Asia, and then across Canada down through the coastline of Latin America. Yes. So pretty much everyone that's part of that.
Yes. So it's including America, China.
It includes America, China, Japan, most ASEAN members.
Economies. Yes.
But it's a large percentage of the global economy.
Coming back to your opening conversation about the the sort of risks prior to pandemic was about protectionism and the rise of protectionism. I think we have seen some more of that, haven't we, with countries protecting their vaccine supplies, and there been some sort of squabbling in the early days about who was going to get what. Are you dealing with that within your own membership? Does that come up in your conversations?
Well, we're trying to find suggestions and recommendations on how we best deal with these issues and deal with really the underlying concerns that we all face. I don't think there's a government in the world would say that we that would sort of prejudice their own populations.
Yeah.
But there are going to be other ways of dealing with real concerns at home. So, for example, should we have stockpiles? Should we have had stockpiles of these things beforehand? Those are the kinds of long-term thinking that we need to have had. Should we have had better pandemic preparedness ahead of time? Rather than having a gut reaction to this. Yeah. Should supply chains really be more robust and resilient? Rather than saying we need to have all of this production at home. So if you think about the importance of global trade was absolutely essential to our ability to cope with the pandemic. So in terms of, say, face masks, the face masks have been a critical part to dealing with the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Global exports of pandemic increased last year by $60 billion. So what that means is the global trade system has helped all of us mm-hmm. be more protected against the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So nationalist policies, protectionist policies won't help you. What it means is the global capacity to produce face masks is somewhere else in the world. It would have been much, much more costly for consumers if we had tried to onshore all of this production at home. Are consumers willing to pay that? Are you willing to pay that? Are companies willing to pay that? I think the answer is going to be no. They'll look for the most efficient way to produce these things. So there are potentially other policy instruments and solutions to dealing with risks. So that's the kind of things we'll be looking at. So when we talk to companies, we'll ask them, how much visibility do you have in your supply chain? And they'll say, well, probably one level. So one of the things we discuss is, well, maybe we need to have greater visibility in our supply chain so we know where everything's coming from, and we need to know where and how all of this fits together so that there can be a real sort of sense of planning about these in case there is another pandemic. That's a sort of conversation we'd be having.
Yes, I think it's a reality that global supply chains are very badly impacted with borders that are closed. And as you said, a lot of flights, is 50% of the trade is on those, was being carried by the planes, which are not flying. And because we've become very globalized in the last 2 decades, a lot of people are relying on supplies from other nations. And of course, the response has been to start sourcing supplies locally, which is impacting price in a lot of occasions.
Right, but there's still, so to just be clear, supplies are still coming from overseas. So when I say $60 billion worth of exports of face masks, it means that international trade is essentially helping us get those face masks from somewhere else, and the main suppliers are all around the world.
Yes, but there is some goods are being given priority because there's a lot of organizations that are unable to get the supplies because the ships are full and the planes are few. And I've heard lots of stories of people who have had to source product locally. When it comes to face masks and resources for essential industries or for the health industries which need those supplies, of course, they get priority.
That was very early on in the pandemic. Was during the first sort of 6-7 months. I think the way global value chains were able to respond is pretty remarkable. I don't know if we would have been able to do that without that global capacity.
I understand, though, that there is still a 2-year backlog in much of the ports around the world.
Yeah, there are, and that's due to some of the regulations that we have. So, for example, so one of the issues we're concerned about is a lack of an international regime for seafarers. A lot of ports are worried about letting seafarers off because of disembark, and that's causing a part of that backlog. We also had the Suez Canal incident, and we also had a shutdown in Yantian port in southern China because of an incident of COVID, and we also had the LA labor shortage in LA port. So a lot of sort of cascading issues in the global shipping industry for why there's that backlog.
Yes,
it's complicated.
So how often do you meet with your members? Is it a monthly meet or?
Actually, our whole group gets together about once a year, and we do specialized groups that meet on specific issues.
Specialized issues, so committees on particular topics.
Committees on specific topics.
What were the main topics before COVID, and how have they changed? Have you now got new committees since COVID, which are addressing COVID specific issues?
So the way we work is our board picks priorities, and we've been very focused over the last few years on what the post-2020 vision for the Asia Pacific region should be.
Right.
And a lot of the issues that we were concerned about before COVID struck are actually issues that we think are still very important. So I don't know if you know, but APEC had been working on its post-2020 vision. And one of the things we'd said in our recommendations was that there are sort of long-term structural issues that we need to be concerned about, which were sort of climate change issues and issues of inequality that need to be dealt with. Remarkably, these are still the same issues, and they were in fact exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. So in a way, COVID gives us an opportunity to really think deep and hard about these issues.
Presumably, most of your member nations have done what the rest of the world has done, which is invest heavily in digital solutions to improve relationship building, servicing customers, sourcing products, all the other main means of operating and running business. Can you just talk to us about what some of the digital developments that you have been seeing?
Yeah, well, digital has really been incredibly important across, I think, the entire region. in dealing with the pandemic. I mean, all of us have been sort of locked down during this crisis. I mean, even on a sort of very micro level in my own office, as the government here announced the shutdown, what we discovered is, of course, not everyone in my office used a laptop. Not everyone in my office had broadband at home. So that's, you know, these are sort of the micro issues that you'll be confronting.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you scale that up across an entire economy, those are the kinds of issues governments will be confronting when schools are closed. So governments will have to ask themselves, how do we make sure that children get education? So, you know, one example would be the government of Indonesia gave out $500 million worth of phone and internet credits to make sure teachers and children could have access to the internet during this period. I mean, that's an enormous challenge that people continue to face. I mean, where I come from in the Philippines, schools are still closed. We actually don't know when they will be open again. I mean, it's just something that we continue to face as a challenge, and that's an enormous loss in productivity across the economies of the region. So it's something that we, you know, have to continue to think about. It's, you know, the telecoms companies are continuing to invest in the infrastructure across the entire region, but you know, there are issues that they need to confront. For example, you know, is there a predictable investment environment for them? Are the rules of the road going to be changed on them? Those are the kinds of things we hear from them. Big investment funds have actually been set up even during the pandemic because they are excited about the prospects of Asia. So that's the kinds of things we hear about in the region.
It must be a challenge for you, being the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, to have both China and the US in your membership, because they're not necessarily quite cooperative at the moment. How does that relationship impact on the group?
One of the great things about PECC is that we have a 40-year tradition of cooperation, and there's a very specific culture that we have in PECC. We're not government officials.
No.
So it's built on 40 years of building trust amongst ourselves. We have very specific objectives. Everyone around the table believes in these norms and the culture and way of doing things. So in reality, we actually don't have these problems. We have co-chairs in PECC, so that the co-chairs, international co-chairs of PECC right now are China and the United States. So we actually don't have these problems in PECC, and we try and find ways of working together. So it's in fact it's something I think extremely beneficial for us, where we try and bring people together and find solutions to problems at this current point in time.
Good to hear. I think you recently authored, along with a colleague from the World Economic Forum, a paper called Trade and Connectivity in the Post-COVID-19 World. Would you just tell us what the main highlights of that report were and what the significance of that is for your regional group?
I mean, it was a pretty wide-ranging paper. I mean, one key message that we wanted to get out was that this is a challenge for both international and domestic institutions. And one of the reasons we had that message was that it's very easy to blame international institutions. You know, why isn't the WHO doing more, the WTO doing more? But we also have to look at the preparedness of our own domestic institutions and ask ourselves, why weren't we more ready for this? How much pandemic preparedness were we doing? But we also looked at what we should be doing and could be doing internationally to ensure that we were prepared for pandemics, and what we could be doing moving ahead to recover from the pandemic in an orderly way. You know, one particular issue we're concerned about is the movement of people. So, for example, we're all still. I mean, this was written in March, I think, 2020, and we still don't have an orderly way for people to move around. So one thing we were talking about was some kind of vaccine passport system. We actually don't have anything.
No. Almost 18 months on, we don't have that yet.
I mean, there are groups like ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, that have systems. The ICC has a system. There are other groups that have systems, but do these systems sort of talk to each other? And these kinds of interoperable systems are critical for very specific people. So if you think about people who actually really need to travel, so we talked earlier about the shipping industry. We really need a system to make sure that these people are sort of don't carry the virus. We need to make sure that the pilots and people working on the planes aren't carrying the virus and that they've been tested. How do you know that they don't? Do they carry a piece of paper that says they're not carriers? How do you make sure that when they land, I don't know, in Sydney or Singapore, how would you know? So we need some kind of system, and that was what we were, one of the key points that we're trying to get across, that some kind of pilot system would be of real value to start talking about, and that was more than a year ago.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you wonder who should be responsible for establishing that. Would it be the World Health Authority? Should they be developing a global vaccine certificate system for us all to? Right.
I mean, they do have. I mean, I don't know if you have one, but they have ones for yellow fever and others. The WHO is working on this. Well, one of the problems is they are working on the science of this.
Yes. Because
the vaccines are so new, we actually don't know how much protection they
really
give
going
us.
To give. Yes.
So they have scientific committees that are working on this, but we're dealing with a moving target, essentially. So we're trying to come up with solutions that are risk-based, that allow us to move ahead, get our economies moving, but keep our societies and our people safe. That's really the challenge.
Well, presumably it would need to be a central global system so that people traveling around the world on holiday or business can get into, can get through the border check, because it doesn't matter what country you go into, they're going to have to check. So rather than carry a piece of paper around, it would be better to have one centralized global system with everybody's tick of approval that they've got their double Pfizered.
You would hope.
You would hope. Because the piece of paper can get lost, but it can also be misinterpreted, and there are problems with language. But I wonder, would people get frightened about having a central database with 8 billion people on it? That's quite
ultimately
that's a big ask, isn't it?
Ultimately would be a mutual recognition of whatever your domestic authority is.
I guess, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you've been.
I don't know if anyone's. Not yet, but I have had an invitation, so I shall go soon. Thank goodness, because I've been keen to march on with it. I'm definitely for it, but I have been starting to think, how are we going to get this piece of paper? And if we're relying on 190 something countries around the world to establish their own systems, they won't all establish them at the same rate. And if we can have one database that records how many cases, deaths and hospitalizations we've got in all the different countries, why can't we have that same central database for the vaccines? It would make sense, but I can see it's a logistical nightmare and a security nightmare. I don't know that the national security and data security people would be too happy about that. But
Probably.
we have to overcome that somehow, don't we?
We need some solution. I mean, we had proposed using the APEC business travel card system, because that's where you have data sharing amongst visa authorities as a pilot. But I don't know where and whether that would work. But that is where it is one platform where government agencies actually cooperate and do share information. But we'll see.
Now, can we just talk about Singapore for a minute? Because as you say, Singapore has a very high vaccination rate. It's 55%, is it?
Yep.
Of the 7 million, which is a good number. And I think the Singapore government has started to voice, its willingness and, keenness to open the borders and to live with the virus. Would you describe, as someone on the ground there, what does that actually mean?
I think it's been a long and interesting journey. I think the first cases of COVID were back in January. I mean, as you've lived here, so you know what it's like. It's an incredibly open city.
Yeah.
It's an open city. It's a densely populated city. So it's been fascinating to live through this. So we went through the early peaks, I think, back in April last year. So I think the government's been dealing with this in a really, I think, remarkable way. I think we've got a total of 64,000 cases over the period, but really minimal deaths. So I think 34.
34 deaths.
I mean, I don't want to I'm not minimizing it, but they've dealt with this really well. I mean, I don't want to sort of minimize that. I mean, it's been dealt with, I think, incredibly well. But I think there is a realization that COVID is something that we're going to have to deal with as we move through, and that every time a cluster of cases comes along, we can't sort of lock down the whole economy. It's just not, it's not tenable. It just costs so much, and people need to be able to move on with their lives. So how do we, taking a risk management approach to this is something that we seem to be wanting to move towards. As long as we can, as long as people aren't, the system's not getting overwhelmed, we don't have people dying from this, then we can move along with our lives, open up. We can have the restaurants open again. So right now our restaurants are closed. I don't know if you know.
Yes,
this.
I do, and it's such a street culture. I mean, who cooks dinner in Singapore? Everybody eats out because it's available, it's fresh, it's affordable, it's right at your doorstep. It's hard for people, isn't it, with all the street markets and the food halls closed.
Right, and we're an international hub.
Yeah.
So people need to be able to at some point move in and out.
Yes.
So that's very important for the economy, and jobs rely on this.
Yes.
So that's something people need to look forward to. So finding a way to manage all of these risks is something very important for the economy. But of course, the number one, of course, is keeping everyone safe.
Yes.
And I think getting the vaccination rates up high, getting everyone there, and dealing with the vulnerable segments of the population is very important here. So that's what we'll I think they'll be focusing on.
Is there a date for when they would like to open the border? Have you got borders open to anyone? I mean, there was a time when Australia and New Zealand were going to include Singapore in the bubble, but that hasn't happened yet. But have you? I
think they are setting certain timelines. I mean, the way they have staged the vaccination has been incredible. So, by a certain date, we will, the first segment of the population were the elderly. Then you move to the 50s to 60s, 40s to 50s. Has been incredibly orderly, and it's very, we talked about digital, very digitally driven. So you receive, you sign up via a website, you get an SMS notification. It's
It's slick, it's always. Yeah.
Incredibly systematic,
Yes.
systematically done.
Yes.
And you get your notification, and it's I think initially it was 4 to 6 weeks between the first and the second jab, when the supply of vaccines was scarce.
Yeah.
They extended the period between first and second jab so that a greater percentage of the population could get covered. I mean, this is how well thought out this is.
Yes. I expect it to be that way in Singapore because it's just how they do things. It's always so systematic and slick, and things just get done. So it's always very impressive. So coming back to, just sort of finishing up on the sort of the future of the region, the priorities for the region were digital and climate change. And obviously, as you say, the current priority is to get through the pandemic. What will you be doing for your members or with your members over the next 6 months to help them get through this next couple of years so that so that all nations can thrive to 2030? Because it's going to be difficult the next couple of years to get through this.
Well, we all know that the future is digital, but what does that mean? So, okay, number one, okay, we still have large digital divides. So one is dealing with the digital infrastructure issues.
Yeah.
But then there's a whole suite of other issues that we need to deal with. So when we were talking about the COVID issue, you brought up the issue of people's data. People are very sensitive about how their data is dealt with. Yes. So you have data privacy issues.
Yes.
And we all come from different cultural backgrounds. So Australia has a certain approach to data privacy. Mm-hmm. Singapore, we have a certain approach to data privacy. China has a certain approach to data privacy. The United States has a certain approach to this. But as we were talking about, PECC covers a broad region. Is there a way that we can all work together, that we can get these data flows moving so that businesses can benefit from this? Mm-hmm. I think of this in a very, very selfish way. We've been locked down. I've been entertaining myself by watching movies on these streaming services.
Yes.
Would I like to have access to different streaming libraries? Of course I would. But, these are the kind of small things that we can think about. And then you've got the different competition policy issues. Different jurisdictions have different ways of dealing with the competition policy elements. What could we learn from each other? That there's a whole suite of issues to deal that can be dealt with. So Australia will have a certain approach to this. The United States will have an approach to this. Indonesia will have an approach to this, and so on. How can we bring down the costs of these things for consumers? So lots of issues. And if we have a conversation amongst ourselves, we might actually learn something. It might actually be helpful.
Yes. I think one of the priorities is your first point, which is closing the data gap. And as you described, Indonesia putting billions of dollars into internet and computers for children in schools, that's the very basic, isn't it? But what we are seeing in most regions is that SMEs who have been very challenged because they've had to shut their doors, people are not coming in, walking past the street and popping into their shop, they're having to find digital ways of reaching their customers. So after 18 months, those who are going to survive, I think, have survived, and they're obviously investing as much as they can in digital and people who can work the digital. And those who just weren't able to get the digital thing happening quickly enough or didn't have the cash to make a pivot, perhaps have not survived. So maybe going forward, there's obviously going to be more collaboration. There's obviously more investment in digital. The technology companies and the agencies that support the technology companies have all done very well out of the last year to 18 months, helping, put services in place and promote their online services to each other. So there's a benefit that comes out of this, which is the huge focus and investment on technology. But there's also a very big social cost to being stuck at home and kids not going to school. So maybe just on that last point, which is the intersection between business and society, and when we do come out of this, there are some considerations and expectations that there might be some difficulty with people reintegrating back into society. I know that the news up in the UK, they're very concerned about the number of people who have now developed a phobia about coming out because they've spent 18 months hiding. Do you have any thoughts about whether that's going to become a sort of a statewide conversation within your group, which is how to address some of these social issues?
It's fascinating. So we one of the things that we did in reaction to the COVID crisis was we did this we did a survey of the regional policy community, and we asked what the priority issues were, and there were the sort of first order concerns dealing with the vaccine and so on, but what came through as a top second order concern was mental health issues, and we see that across the entire region where calls to sort of distress helplines have just increased massively.
Yes.
When people aren't having that human connection, it puts them under tremendous stress. Your normal life has been completely upturned.
Yes.
So it's not something that regional institutions
normally think
of, but it's something that we are all struggling with. APEC does have a mental health roadmap, so it's just something that maybe government agencies that within their own respective domains, can just share lessons with. That's probably something that is quite helpful to discuss amongst themselves and whatever lessons they are learning through going through this crisis.
Well, APEC is obviously going to provide you with some resources on this topic. So if they've already got an initiative underway, that's really helpful. I do think that as we get through the next 12 months, we'll start to see and better understand what these challenges are, how big they are, and start to get our heads around the magnitude of it. It's been really great talking with you today. I'm sorry we haven't got longer to chew the fat on this, because there's so much to think about, isn't there? The considerations are huge, and obviously the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council is doing a great job keeping in touch with its members and helping them through these challenging times. So I really appreciate you sharing this time with us and giving us some insights into what you do. And I'm sure viewers watching will be keen to reach out to you when they if they can, for help and support along the way. So thank you very much for joining us, Eduardo. But before you go, there's that big last question that I'd like to put to you, which is, if you found yourself chief executive of the world in the future, I know it's a great notion, isn't it? What would be top of mind for you? I mean, you're sitting in a great seat, looking across, 50% of world trade here, and the huge, I guess the population of the world is probably a similar number. What would be top of mind for you of things that are urgent to address?
It's a great question. The pandemic really has been a tremendous, it's a horrible experience, but it's something that all of us around the world have gone through, and it's been I can imagine at least, a very similar shared experience for all of us. We've all gone through it, and I think it's something to build off. You alluded to this earlier in our conversation, that actually the past few years haven't been tremendously good, I think, in terms of international relations. There's a lot of tension out there, and things could get bad. And I don't think we can pretend that it's otherwise. There's a lot of tension out there. There are international disagreements. There's a lot of protectionism and a lot of mistrust amongst our different communities. But given this shared experience, if I was the global CEO the point I would be making is we've gone through this shared experience. We've all suffered from this. This is something to build off, and I think we really need to come to the realization that we can only overcome these problems by working together. So that's what we need to do.
Great thought, a great answer. Thank you so much. I think that's a really insightful, which is building off the shared experience, because it's not very often we get this opportunity.
People have likened this to this generation's war, and that's how people were able to build institutions. We built the institutions of the IMF, the World Bank, the UN after the Second World War. What can we do now?
Yes, because even the GFC didn't touch children or some parts of the communities, but this has affected everybody, and the children who have had spent the last 18 months doing homeschooling will never forget their 18 months of homeschooling, whereas an adult, it will impact them and who they become. So that's a terrific answer. Thank you so much, Eduardo. Been really nice talking with you. Thank you for joining us on Thrive 2030. Eduardo Pedrosa, Pacific Economic Council from Singapore. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Okay, talk to you soon.